Okay, we're going to look at gender in media. Now, media pervades our everyday life in the form of the internet, television, movies, videos, games, music, advertisements, magazines, news programs, books, cell phones, tablets, all sorts of things. So social media, as you're probably well aware, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube have all increased the popularity, and it makes it easier to connect with one another. 93% of teens use the internet, and most of it every single day. Now, social media offers the opportunity for people to become producers and not just consumers of the media. So let's begin with looking at media saturation of cultural life. Now, people today are media saturated and media engaged, with as many as 98.9% of all households owning at least one TV. That's not to mention the internet and access to devices, cell phones, tablets. Now, films, newspapers, magazines, advertising, radio, and social media fill our lives with media. Social media allows us to connect with others, shop, participate in online communities, and even produce media. So, what are some of the impacts of media? Let's look and consider media impacts. Now, although most people think that they are immune to media influences, it's called the third person effect, which is essentially the belief that others are more affected by media than we are, and that's just not true. Research has found that media shapes our identities, and shapes our understandings, and shapes our opinions. And as much as we think we're immune, we are inundated with it, and therefore it becomes a part of our consciousness, even part of our subconsciousness. We're not even aware of the impact when it impacts us. Media influences how we perceive the roles of men and women, and the relationships in at least 5 important ways. Now, I'm going to review these 5 important ways. They are, of course, in your textbook. But this is how it influences, how media can influence who I see myself as a man as being, and my relationship with a woman, and how women see themselves and their relationships with men. So the first point we're going to look at is what's known as set the agenda. The agenda setting theory suggests that media tells us what's important by virtue of the things that we see, the news that gets reported. All of it seems to suggest that these are the things that are important you to pay attention to. The way that advertisement happens around the holiday season are letting us know what's important. Now, these theories argue that media doesn't tell us what to think, but they do tell us what to think about. Now, one of the roles that's played within society, and including media, is what's called a gatekeeper. And this is a person or a group who controls what messages get through to the consumer. This could include editors, owners, producers, are examples of gatekeepers. Now, these particular groups of people, these gatekeepers, can control what gets out, what they think is important. You've maybe heard the term, it leads, if it bleeds, it leads. That's coming from the gatekeeper, if you will, the editor, who's looking for sensational and critical things that people would want to be paying attention to. And it's not so much that it's telling people what to think, but what to think about. So that's the first, setting the agenda. The second is what's called, we're going to touch bases in terms of regulating images of women and men. And there's a group of people who are basically underrepresented, and typically underrepresented women and minorities. Now, although women outnumber men in the population, they're not equally visible in the media, particularly as substantive characters, main roles. Women are rarely shown as authorities in the news programming. Minority group members are more likely to appear in supporting roles and are more likely to be shown with their own racial culture and values obscured. That just basically means that in spite of my being perhaps of Mexican heritage, The role that I'll play in a particular show or movie may not exhibit that much of my own culture. It'll be me blending in with the culture that exists predominantly, white culture. So when minority groups are represented, they are shown in ways that aligns them with particular stereotypes. Now 3, we're going to look at portraying men stereotypically. And you might be saying, well, women are typically the target of stereotypical views. Well, so are men, and not always in the most positive. Portrayals of men include depictions of males as independent, as strong, as aggressive, and in charge. Traditionally masculine men are praised and valued in the media. Now, white masculinity is shown as the standard for all men. Now, hip-hop and rap music is a rare exception where other groups can be seen in positive lights, but it tends to emphasize problematic stereotypes of black men. It doesn't represent necessarily in a more positive, anti-stereotypical way, if you will. More complex portrayals of men, for example, men who are caring, men who are sensitive, are sometimes offered, but they're not as often seen as the more stereotypical traditional man. Now the 4th area we'll look at is portraying women stereotypically, and the portrayals of women include depictions of female presented as shoppers, grooming, being emotional, being focused on men, being sexual, and performing domestic activities. Now whiteness is still considered the standard and considered the ideal. Now clearly we have a much more diverse population than what the standard appears to represent. Images of black women are often based on very negative stereotypes. Asian women and Latinos are often presented in more exotic and sexualized ways. Women are frequently seen as sex objects. Even the animated films show women with very small waists and very large breasts. Now, even as girls are sexualized, the media reinforces the notion that they alone are responsible for the consequences of sex. Women are usually seen as either good or bad. Bad women are witches, bitches, whores, or iron maidens. Good women are often pretty or passive, but this ideal has been challenged and expanded in more recent advertising and film industry, but it still has a great deal of way to go. Women like the angels in Charlie's Angels, or Rose in Titanic, or the women on Sex and the City and Desperate Housewives may have seemed progressive and strong at first, but all those women have also been very traditional feminine characteristics and dependent upon men. And then the 5th point we'll bring up is gendered images in advertising. Now, ads also show these gender portrayals of men and women. We are repeatedly exposed to the same messages. A majority of ads feature visual images, which are less subject to conscious analysis and verbal claims. We tend to think we are immune to advertising. Ads for men portray them in stereotypical ways and tend to link hypermasculinity and violence. Men are seen as unable to do domestic tasks like clean and care for children. Men are seen as lazy and incompetent in the home, even though women are seen as being successful in the home. Male authority is still seen in ads through either voiceovers by men and in male images like Mr. Clean, even though they seem to be directed towards women. The objectification of women is often seen in ads. Women's sexuality is used to sell products, and many of the products sold to women are about their physical appearance. Advertising presents the foci of women's lives as physical appearance and pleasing others. Now, certainly we've seen some changes in this, but it's not nearly as profound enough as what it can be. Now, there's a couple of terms to remember or to be aware of within this area of advertising, and one is known as the complementary copy. This is where articles that increase the appeal of the product are made available. Product placement. This is where brands or products that are mentioned in another form of media. You know, saying Coca-Cola in the book or noticing in the film that some of the characters are drinking Coca-Cola is product placement. And the last, or the second, or the third term, sorry, is the immersive advertising. This is where a product or a brand that is incorporated into an entire storyline. An example of that is Prada and Gossip Girl books. All influences our relationships to products. Now, a sixth point we should bring up is what's called motivating us to consume. And here, some analysis argue that the primary function of media is to encourage us to buy things and services. Overly perfect bodies in the media can cause us to think that our own bodies are inadequate, but offers us products that purport to change our bodies and self-images. You know, you can watch Dr. Oz and find all kinds of miracle cures, but he's been brought to Congress to answer to some of the claims that he's making as being unfounded, and he's had to acknowledge that they are, and yet they're out there. This pill will make you lose weight and be your best self. You know, this is part of what the inundation has been with media and our view of ourselves. Media causes us to perceive normally functioning bodies as unacceptable or defective. Things that we'll start to see, and we have been seeing, has been the use or steroid abuse is one of the consequences for men who don't see their bodies being the way that they see them in advertisement and need to build muscle, and they do so through steroid use in some cases. It's an epidemic in some areas of the world. Normal changes in men's sexual vigor are shown as something to cure with drugs. Women's body hair is represented as something to remove with products like razors and shaving cream. Plastic surgery is one of the more common and have long-lasting effects for those who choose to undergo operations. And all of this is around the kind of images that we see and what we tend to absorb as how we're supposed to be. So let's move into gender and social media. Now, our use of social media to communicate with others is closely related to gender issues. And we'll look at some of this relationship. We'll begin with a gendered use of social media, and we'll look at where there are some gender differences, if you will, in how men and women use social media. Men and women don't use it precisely the same. It's out there for all to use, but like men and women being different in a lot of other areas, so is how they use social media. Men and boys tend to be more instrumental in their use of these media, using them to set up activities, for example. Men and boys also tend to use some social media such as games and virtual spaces more than women do. Girls and women see phone conversations and textings as a way of nurturing relationships. And so they tend to use these devices and these social medias quite a bit differently. So some of the functions of social media, well, social networking is one of the functions. One of the most popular uses of social media is the social networking. Women and girls tend to use social networking as a resource for creating and maintaining relationships. Girls and women frequently use social networking for self-development, talking about their experiences and thoughts and incorporating others' reactions into those ideas, into their own identities. Now, social networks can also have a major downside. As you probably are aware, cyberbullying. Now, cyberbullying is a communication via social networks that is meant to hurt or humiliate another person. The LGBTQ teens, girls, who are less physically developed or perceived as less or more attractive than their peers, and boys, especially non-white boys, who are perceived as more feminine than their peers, are most likely to be cyberbullied. Now, cyberbullying has a major consequence for its victims, ranging from troubled sleeping to anxiety to even suicide. And there, of course, have been some very noteworthy examples of suicide as a result of cyberbullying in the news. Cyberbullying is different than face-to-face bullying in that it can be done anonymously and that it has no boundaries, following the victim at all times. Parsons, the young woman who committed suicide out in the East Coast, was cyberbullied by a 43-year-old man in Sweden, and he has since been charged. I mean, no boundaries. It doesn't matter where you are. If you have access to social media, so does your tormentors. Learning and sharing information, well, the internet offers unparalleled sources of information about gendered issues. Users can also find support and information related to specific issues. The transgendered groups have huge support online from one another in creating safe places. Holding others accountable. Social media are frequently used to hold organizations and powerful interests accountable for sexism and gender violence. You'll see people complaining about companies who have advertised inappropriately, and those companies, because of the social media complaints and the advertising that consumers can do and the pressure that they can bring to bear, change their approaches. Activism. Social communities are frequently used for purposes of activism. You've been seeing some things recently with the Me Too campaign. Organizations can use social media sites to get their message out to interested parties. Social media is also allows activists to organize fast responses to issues. For those of you who might remember, the Egyptian uprising from about 3 years ago was largely brought about by social media. So now let's move to consequences of gendered media. Now, some of the consequences: it normalizes unrealistic standards, potentially with the amount of media that we are exposed to. You know, we are exposed to unexpected, when we are exposed to the unrealistic images of men and women in the media, we tend to see ourselves as inadequate. We see overly beautiful women and overly beautiful men, and we expect that we should be able to achieve the same results or be the same sort. Media exposes us to flawed representations of relationships as well. You know, whether it be watching Springer and the kinds of everyday experiences you see on his program as being normal or as commonplace, or seeing the relationships in movies as being so romanticized that all relationships should be this way. This can cause us to assess our own relationships unfairly. People can become dissatisfied with real, healthy relationships as a result of these images. Pathologizing the natural body can be dangerous. This is the emphasis on thinness that can lead to eating disorders that are not uncommon, unfortunately. Men are increasingly affected by unrealistic expectations as well. You look at magazines you can find in the bookstores, and look at men's health and women's health, and look at the kinds of images on women's magazines and men's magazines that men and women are exposed to as being the standard. Now, we're going to touch base on normalizing violence against women, and this has been a very big issue in the theaters, in advertising, in social media. There is evidence that violence in the media contributes to increasing violence in real life. Research shows that when men watch sexually explicit films that degrade women, they become more dominant towards women around them. Now, this research is predicated by the predisposition that some men have towards aggressive behavior, that this increases the likelihood, as opposed to somebody who has well-grounded masculine strengths without that being something to lord over somebody else. They are less prone to be more aggressive because of the depictions. Another study shows that men who watch music videos and pro wrestling believe that forcing a partner to have sex is sometimes acceptable. And we still see this in colleges and universities around Canada and the US, around rape issues and what's considered to be acceptable. And, you know, the No campaign got used inappropriately at some universities. Most recently I read was in Queen's University. When we see violence frequently in the media, we can come to see it as a normal part of life. Now, there's several theories of gender development show that the relationship between media violence and real life violence, that there is this relationship and that it can bleed over, if you will. Social learning theory would argue that when men and boys see images of men being rewarded for engaging in violence against women, that they would be more likely to behave that way themselves. Now, some of the movies that we watch might not be of that nature explicitly, but because there is an aggressive overtone towards women, it gets interpreted as being acceptable and okay. Cognitive development theory would say that when women and girls see women in media inviting or allowing violence against them, they might think such violence is acceptable. And then we look at symbolic interactionalism. Well, they would say that social views of relationships represented in the media can affect how we see our own relationships. And this extends to all sorts of media. There's a lot of research starting to emerge looking at what the role of young people, young teens, particularly boys, but not exclusively, watching porn, and what that does to the quality of the relationship expectations in interpersonal relationships between men and women as they grow up. That becomes normalized and expected behavior when, that's not the limit, nor the expectation of what a good and healthy long-term relationship is. And so there's an awful lot about how media affects our everyday life, whether we think it does or not. I hope this has been helpful in understanding this chapter. Now, enjoy your break, have a good holiday, and don't forget we have tests coming up in the new year. Be prepared and be ready.